Today I'm going to show you how to change a clutch in a 2001 Subaru Impreza. And we'll be installing this ACT Streetlight Flywheel and their Performance Street Clutch. Let's see what's in the box. We got a brand new release bearing. We got the alignment tool, which we'll definitely need. New pilot bearing, the clutch disc, and there's the pressure plate. Comes with all new bolts, and look at that. This thing is a piece of art. This thing is gorgeous. It's already got a pilot bearing pressed into it, so we won't need the one from the clutch kit. That's just one less step, which is nice. Can't wait to get this on the car. To get access to the clutch, we have to separate the engine and the transmission. And there's really two ways to do that. You can pull the engine out, or you can pull the transmission out. I find that pulling the transmission out is a little bit easier. There's less fluids you have to change. And if you can keep the drive shaft attached to the back of the transmission, you won't actually lose any transmission fluid at all. So that's what we're going to do today. Since we're trying to get to the transmission, it's pretty simple. Basically, we just have to keep taking stuff off, starting from the bottom and working our way up. Obvious first thing here is this exhaust system. First step is to get the O2 sensors out of the way. You actually don't have to remove them from the exhaust. Just follow the line up to the connector, disconnect that, and then it'll drop down with the exhaust. The connection for the forward O2 sensor is actually right up here with this main engine harness. In the back it's really easy. There's just these rubber mounts that just slide right off, and we'll drop it out. When unbolting this back flange of the drive shaft, I found the best way to do it is rotate this so that you can get access to two bolts, put the parking brake on, and then go ahead and break those bolts loose. Take the parking brake off, and then you can rotate the drive shaft until you get to the next two bolts, put the parking brake back on, and then unbolt those. Once you get all these bolts out, the drive shaft still stays where it is because it's got a centering flange. Once we drop the center carrier bearing, this whole thing will be able to flex and come out. If you're just going to take this all the way out, which would be a lot easier, make sure you drain the transmission fluid first. As we drop this, the rear end comes out and the whole thing comes down. In case you're wondering why I'm leaving the drive shaft in and I'm not just changing the transmission fluid, it's because I just did a transmission fluid change and it's got limited slip oil in here, which is fairly expensive. So I'm going to try and keep as much in as possible. And then we just need to disconnect the shift linkage. There's two bolts in here. We'll pull those off and that'll be free. And I recommend taking the time to go ahead and pull the shift linkage out. Bottom linkage is just a nut. There's a large washer, and this link just slides off of a shaft on the transmission. On your street car, you'll obviously have the center console and the shift boot on here. Just go ahead and unscrew your shift knob, and then that plastic trim around the edge just pops out, and that slides off with your boot. Underneath, you'll see these 6 Phillips screws, and you'll just remove it like I'm about to do now. Then this metal plate just comes right out. And now this rubber piece is free to move with the shifter. You can take that out, or if you leave it with the transmission, it'll drop out the bottom. I'm also removing this rear shifter bushing, and that'll allow this to slide out easier because there's just not enough room to move everything forward and still be able to get this out. And it actually ended up being easier pulling the shift linkage out through the bottom. In order to free up these CV shafts, we're punching this pin out, and that's what holds them from sliding in and out. And as you can see, this won't slide all the way off the car. We have to actually move the CV shaft out. There's a couple different ways to do that, but the easiest way is to remove the bolt at the bottom of the ball joint and then slide the ball joint out of the hub, and that'll let the whole suspension swing out of the way. So all we have to do is remove this one bolt, and then if we push down on this A-arm, the whole thing should slide out, and it'll let this hub assembly swing out of the way. It's also helpful to disconnect the sway bar to allow this to move out of the way. And on this side of the car, I wanted to show you another way of doing it. You can remove the two bolts that hold your strut to the hub assembly, and then you'll be able to tilt the hub out of the way, and it'll do the same thing. Obviously, this is racing suspension, so my nuts and bolts look a little bit different than your car will, but it works exactly the same way. And you will have to get an alignment, because once you move these, it will change the alignment, and you can get it close, but not quite right. One thing to be careful of is your brake line. Make sure that you're not hanging all this weight. Find a way to support this. I'm just going to tie this up real quick. To disconnect the wiring of this manual transmission, there's two connectors, a large one down here and this small one up here. This car is equipped with a hydraulic clutch, so we're going to remove these two bolts and remove this hydraulic cylinder. And I just put the bolts back in so that I don't lose them. And I want to make sure that that's out of the way, because when we drop the transmission, that line will stay connected with the firewall. So now we've got everything disconnected. The only thing that's left is this transmission crossmember and the bolts going into the engine. Before I do that, I want to make sure to get my transmission jack in here, but it won't fit between this crossmember and the engine crossmember. So what I'm doing is I'm temporarily supporting this with a normal jack. I'm not putting any pressure up, it's just sitting up against it. I'll go ahead and remove this transmission crossmember, and then I can hold the back end of this transmission up by hand while I get the transmission jack in place. There you go, just pull it toward you. First bolts we want to move are the ones that are holding the starter motor on, and there are two bolts. This one on top also holds this ground wire. That bottom bolt is really buried, so I'm going to crawl under the car and get it from the bottom. When you pull the starter motor out, it just slides right out. Then just let it hang there. If you need to, you can always tie it up to something on the firewall. Alright, before we remove the rest of the bolts going from the transmission to the engine, we need to remove this pitch stop bracket. It connects the transmission to the firewall, and that's what keeps the whole engine transmission assembly from rocking front to back excessively. Once that's out, we need to support the engine before we pull the transmission out. There's a few different ways to do this. What we're going to do is actually hook a strap from the alternator bracket back to the firewall where the pitch stop mount is, and that way not only will it support the engine, but we can actually tilt the engine back slightly, and that'll help with getting the transmission on and off. We've got our strap in place, and now we can take out the last of the bolts. Alright, there's a couple bolts way down at the bottom on both sides, and you can determine whether it's easier to get that from the top or from the bottom of the car. Alright, we've got all the nuts and bolts out of the engine and transmission. They're not all the same length, so it helps to lay them out in order so you know which one goes where. Now it's time to get the transmission off of the engine. Oftentimes they don't want to come apart. They've been together for a long time. What you want to do is just wiggle the transmission and or the engine and just keep doing this. Sometimes it can be frustrating and take a long time, but they will come apart. What I like to do first is lower the transmission a little bit, which will rock the engine back. We can snug up our strap, and that'll hold the engine at a downward angle. Just be careful, you don't want to pull too far back because it will twist on the engine mounts. Alright, I've got that strap snug up top, so that'll keep the engine from wanting to rotate forward. It is front heavy. Now, supporting the back of the transmission, I'm going to go ahead and lower this jack just a little bit more. And now we can start wiggling this transmission and see if we can get it to separate from the engine. Sometimes this part can be frustrating. You'll wiggle and wiggle for a long time and it just doesn't want to separate the transmission. Really resist the urge to stick something between the engine and transmission and pry on it. It's really not good for those flanges. Just keep wiggling and it'll come out. During this stage, it also helps to have a friend up top that can kind of tell you what's going on. But I just went up there and checked, and I can see the transmission's already starting to separate, so we just got to keep working at it, and it'll come off. I went topside, and I could see that the top of the transmission was coming off, but not the bottom. So what that meant is I had to rock the engine back just a little bit farther, so I could pick up more on the transmission. And now it's coming out. Got to jack it up a little bit to get it over the cross member, and it should slide right out. At the front of the transmission is actually up hitting the firewall, so I need to lower the front down and pick the back up. Alright, now the transmission is down and out of the way. At this point, you can pull it out from under the car if you want, if you need to do any work on it. But otherwise, you just need enough access to get to the bolts for the pressure plate and flywheel. There's a series of bolts around the outside of this pressure plate, and we'll get those loose. There you go, there's the clutch and pressure plate. The pressure plate does stay on the flywheel because it's got a couple pins, so it doesn't drop straight down, but definitely be ready to catch this stuff. It's fairly heavy. Alright, next we want to remove the flywheel. We've got these bolts in the center that connect it to the crankshaft. Alright, we're removing the last bolt. Be very careful with these flywheels. Some of them can be very heavy. On the transmission side, we've got the throwout bearing. Even if yours seems good, I recommend replacing these every time because these can be on their way to failure, and it's best just to go ahead and replace it. There's just these little metal clips on the side, and we'll pop that off and it'll slide right off of there. The way these clips work is they kind of rotate backwards. Unclip the front, and then you can usually get this thing to start rotating backwards, and it'll come off of that top clip. Like that. And the other side is just the opposite. It rotates downward. Right, anytime you take a clutch off, you should really inspect it, see if there's anything significantly wrong that might be a sign of something more going on. No sign of anything unusual here with the clutch. We'll check out the engine and transmission and just make sure that it's okay as well. Alright, on the transmission side, this looks good. We're looking for signs of cracks or leaks or anything, and it looks good to me. I don't see anything wrong with this transmission at all. On the back of the engine, we're looking for significant signs of leakage or cracking or anything unusual. This engine does have some seeping from the rear main seal. It's got 160,000 miles, so it's kind of to be expected. It's not pouring out oil, and I haven't had any issues with it getting low on oil between oil changes. So I'm going to go ahead and leave this. Now we're just cleaning off all the machining oil that's left on this flywheel. I want to make sure it's nice and dry, otherwise you can get chattering and slipping of your clutch. There's a little pilot nub sticking out here on the end of the crankshaft, and our new lightweight flywheel just goes right over that. The kit comes with new bolts. So you just rotate the flywheel until the bolt lines up. Once you get one started, this thing is not going anywhere. So now we can get all the rest of the bolts started by hand, and then we'll start tightening them with a wrench in a star pattern. and come back and torque them to 50 foot-pounds. One thing you'll find as you start tightening these is you'll just start turning the motor over and it won't get fully tight. The easiest thing I've found is to put a 22mm socket on a breaker bar on the front crank pulley. Then you can hold that with one hand and then tighten up with your other hand. I just like to wipe these flywheels down one more time, just in case you left any fingerprints while you're torquing the bolts. Next we're going to install our new release bearing. First step is to make sure that this snout is really clean and free of dirt and debris. Now we're going to install our new release bearing, which came pre-greased from ACT. And these clips go right back in place just like the old one came off. Now that we've got the splines lightly greased on the inside of the clutch, we can slide it on the input shaft to the transmission, and you can see it's transferring a little bit of grease. Now I'm just going to slide it back and forth to transfer as much grease as possible, and just have to be careful that we don't get any grease on the clutch material. You can hold on to the edge of the clutch, or use some paper towels and hold on to that edge, and then you can handle it safely that way. Now that these splines are greased, you want to wipe off any excess, because if you have any excess grease, it will fly out and could get on your clutch disc, and that'll ruin the clutch. So make sure to wipe off anything that's left over. Now the transmission is ready to go, and we can install the clutch on the back of the engine. The pressure plate comes with oil on it, and we will need to clean that off, so we'll do that now. It's really important to get these super clean. This will prevent the clutch from slipping or chattering. When installing the clutch disc, make sure you get the orientation correct. Next we'll be using the clutch alignment tool, and this just ensures that the disc itself is perfectly centered with your pilot bearing, and that ensures that the transmission will slide on. I find the easiest way to do this so that you can handle the clutch without touching the disc is actually use the alignment tool in the center of the disc, and then insert this into the pilot bearing. Double check that your pressure plate is nice and clean, and then you can go ahead and install it. Trick is to make sure that those pins are lined up, and then you can get some bolts started. Tighten all these bolts down in a star pattern evenly, because your pressure plate is just a giant spring, and you don't want to put all the torque on one bolt. So slowly work it in, and then once it's in there, the clutch disc is held firmly, and you can go ahead and take your alignment tool out. Now we can go ahead and use our torque wrench and tighten these guys down to 25 foot-pounds. And again, we'll put the breaker bar with the 22mm on the crank pulley, so we can keep the engine from spinning. Now that the clutch is installed and all your bolts are torqued, a little bit of extra grease came out when I pulled the alignment tool out, so now's the chance to use your paper towel and clean up the extra grease. And one last thing to check before you put the transmission in. The transmission should have 2 alignment pins. This transmission is missing one on this side. Sometimes they'll stick with the engine, but in this case I'm actually missing one. So I'm going to install an extra alignment pin that I got from my Subaru dealer. Alright, now it's time to get the transmission hooked back up to the engine. A couple things to consider. One, in this case, we're trying to keep the drive shaft in the transmission. So when we slide this forward, we got to make sure the drive shaft slides forward with the transmission. Also, the splines on the input shaft to the transmission may not line up to the splines on the new clutch you just installed. You can use a punch through the pinhole on the front CV shaft outputs on your transmission. Just rotate those, and that should rotate the input shaft as well. Or you can always try rotating the drive shaft and rotate it that way. You just have to make sure that the transmission is in gear. So as you start to slide this on, it'll slide onto the studs on the bottom of the engine first. That'll be your first point of alignment. Then go up top and really double check. Make sure that nothing's in between the engine and transmission. You might have a cable in there or some other part. Also, while you're up there, you can check the alignment of the transmission. Make sure that it's going on square. See which way you need to move the tail, up, down, left, right. So I was able to rotate the drive shaft and get the splines to line up. And now that I can tell the splines are engaged because the drive shaft won't wiggle anymore. So now we just need to keep working the transmission until we get it all the way forward and fully engaged. The last little bit of the transmission is always the hardest. That's where you're trying to get those pins perfectly aligned with the engine, and everything has to be just right. It helps to have someone up top that can look and tell you which way to move the transmission, or sometimes you have to rotate it a little bit. If you're doing this by yourself, like I am, just take your time, move it a little bit, go back, look at up top, and see how things are lining up. In this case, I've got to rotate the transmission just slightly. We're getting really close here. We're down to the last little bit. Sometimes it's tempting to throw bolts in and just really crank this thing down. Make sure you don't do that. If something's hung up, you'll just break something internal to the transmission. You could even crack the case. It's going to take a bunch of wiggling. Just really get it settled and make sure it's fully seated before you stick any bolts in. And there you go. The gap is all nice and sealed. Took a lot of extra wiggling. Had to adjust the jack a couple times to make sure the transmission was nice and square. But now we're nice and seated. So I can start throwing this thing back together, put all the bolts back in. Also, I want to check that new pin that I put in on this side. You can see it's not quite fully seated, so I'm just going to take a hammer and just really lightly tap that in until it's fully seated. At this point, everything's going together great. Everything goes back together just the way it came apart. I won't bore you with the details. One piece of advice is on these pins that go through the CV shaft into the output shaft on the transmission. Make sure that the holes line up perfectly. If the CV shafts are 180 degrees out, the holes will be very close, but they'll be off just slightly. So make sure that you look through those holes, stick a punch in there, and make sure that there's no edges that are catching where the pin might go. If it catches just a little bit, rotate the CV shafts 180 degrees, and it should go on just perfect. And another tip, these sway bar end links, I unbolted them to get a little bit more droop out of the A-arms to get the CV shafts out easier, but they actually flex quite a bit when the car is at full droop. So go ahead and put the tires back on and lower the car down, and it'll make those a lot easier to get back in.
Two, one, go.
I just got back from racing the rally in the 100-acre wood, and it was awesome. Over 100 miles of flat-out racing, and this clutch and flywheel performed perfectly the entire time. The pedal is nice and smooth, the engagement is super consistent and nice and firm, there was no slipping issues, and it was awesome. I highly recommend this clutch and flywheel. Even just doing the test drive and break-in period around town before the race, I could tell this clutch was awesome. It's way better than those stock replacement clutches that I've put in my street car, which is also a 2001 RS. So highly recommend this clutch and flywheel, and hopefully this helped. Hit that subscribe button, stay tuned for more episodes, and hopefully I'll see you at the races.